Well, on behalf of Dean Zelda Harris, who is with us this evening, and the Loyola community, I'd like to welcome you. I'm Diane Garrity, Director of Loyola Civitas Child Law Center. This evening, two of the nation's leading racial justice advocates, Professor Kris Henning and Professor James Forman, will engage in a conversation based on Professor Henning's powerful and widely acclaimed new book, The Rage of Innocence: How America Criminalizes Black Youth. It's a topic that could not be more timely for a city where, since 2013, Chicago police have killed more young people than any other law enforcement agency in the nation, and where this year, more children have been shot on the streets of Chicago than those who died of COVID across the nation. As a law school and university, Loyola is committed to preparing graduates who will be ethical advocates for justice and equity, including challenging the profound racial disparities that infect our juvenile and criminal justice systems. This evening is an opportunity to advance that mission. I'd like to thank the Catholic Criminal Justice Network, the Lumen Christi Institute, the Honorable Tom Donnelly, one of our graduates, and my colleagues Lisa Jacobs and Griselda Sanchez for facilitating this program. Finally, and importantly, The Rage of Innocence is now available in bookstores and online. And after this evening's program, Professor Henning will be available for signing copies in the back of the room. And now I'll turn over the podium to my colleague, Professor Maria Havillo.
Thanks, everyone. I'm delighted to be here to welcome all of you and to welcome Kris and James tonight. I'd like to thank, as Diane did, Dean Harris and Loyola for supporting this important conversation and topic tonight. I'd like to thank Diane Garrity, Professor Diane Garrity, and Lisa Jacobs as well, and to say just a couple of words about the Catholic Criminal Justice Reform Network, which is an initiative of the Lumen Christi Institute and a co-sponsor of this event. Though the church has often not been audible, in this century at least, with respect to mass incarceration and the criminalization of our youth, the Catholic Criminal Justice Reform Network has come together to offer perspectives and to bring together important conversations such as the one tonight. So for that, I'd like to thank Judge Donnelly as well. Now about tonight. What a treat it is to introduce Professors Kris Henning and Professor James Forman here. Kris has been representing young children accused of crime in Washington, D.C. for more than 25 years. She's done so at the D.C. Public Defender Service, where the three of us have worked at one time or another. She has done so as the director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at the Georgetown Law, where she currently works as a professor. She is a nationally recognized trainer and consultant on issues of race, crime, and adolescence and policing. Kris's book is born of the experience she has had as a practitioner, as an observer, as a witness in the courtrooms of DC Superior Court. She has also been a co-founder of a number of initiatives to combat racial injustice and inequities in the juvenile legal system. Among them, the Ambassadors for Racial Justice Program and a racial justice toolkit for youth defenders. She's the recipient of many awards, including the 2021 Leadership Prize from the Juvenile Law Center. Her book, as Diane said, could not be more timely on the wake of recent reports in newspapers and throughout the country about the juvenile injustice system. Her book is really about the experience she has had as a juvenile defender. Joining her in conversation tonight is Professor James Forman, Jr., a professor of law at Yale Law School. James clerked for Supreme Court Justice O'Connor and then went on to have a career as a public defender at the DC Public Defender Service. He represented children and adults accused of crime there and advanced a school to help the educational needs of young kids he was serving. He's a scholar and a teacher, a speaker on issues of racial injustice and mass incarceration, and the Pulitzer Prize winning author of Locking Up Our Own. And personally, Kris and James have been mentors, friends, and colleagues. When I was a young lawyer at the DC Public Defender Service, it was Kris, like many others there, to whom we ran when we had questions about what to do with our kid who wasn't going to get to go home tonight, or how to huddle and give advice to one of our young clients. Kris stood next to us in courtrooms. She huddled with us outside of courtrooms. She helped advise us and train us. So tonight is really a delight to welcome them to Chicago and to listen once again to these two people. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Maria. So now we're going to have the fireside chat. We don't have the fireside, but you imagine it. And I think we are so lucky tonight. Kris Henning is one of America's great lawyers. She is one of America's great advocates for children. She's one of America's great racial justice fighters. And she's one of America's great teachers. She was all those things until about a year ago when she let me know that she was adding another great to her list because she was going to become and now has become one of America's great authors. So I am so pleased to be able to be in this conversation with my longtime friend and colleague, and I want to just jump right in if we can. So the subtitle of your book is How America Criminalizes Black Youth. And I'd just like to start by hearing you talk a little bit on what you mean by that. How does America criminalize Black adolescents?
Absolutely. And I do have to just quickly say thank you to James, my friend, to Maria, to Diane, Tom, two Toms. There are just so many folks out here, and then so many friends and colleagues, Reba, Robin, everybody, Ali, I will stop. But I think Chicago is such an incredibly important place to have this conversation. And when Tom Donnelly invited me to join, I immediately said, it's Chicago. This is the home of juvenile justice advocacy. That's the way I've always seen Chicago. So I'm really happy to be here to talk specifically about the criminalization of Black children. And when I think about, and I talk about criminalization, I am talking about it from three broad buckets. I'm talking about the criminalization of normal adolescent behaviors, those things that every one of us did as a kid. It's by definition what adolescence means. So that's part of it, and we can talk more about that. I'm talking also about the over-policing or the hyper-surveillance of Black children in America in many different forms. And when I talk about policing, I should just note from the outset that I am talking about all of the ways in which we police Black children. And that's law enforcement officers, but us as civilians, right? The ways in which we engage with young people, young Black children, as if they are to be feared. Okay. And then the third way I talk about criminalization in the book is once a child enters the system, even if they've done a crime, they've committed some transgression, how do we treat them once they get there? And so I'm talking about those disparities that exist, the dehumanization the punishment, the lack of grace and forgiveness for young people once they get into the system. So really, we could pick up on any of those threads. So I might even just kick it back to you, to see what threads we want to pull out.
Absolutely. So I want to pick up on those threads, but want to just put one more thing about your book on the table that I think is really important for people to know, because there are the ideas in the book, and then there's also the question of how you advance those ideas, of how you tell that story. So I just want to put that on the table and then go back and talk about some of what you just said. I mean, because one of the things I love so much about the book is, yeah, you have numbers, you have empirical research, you have studies, but fundamentally it's a book that's full of stories. It's stories of young people from across the country and the injustices and the challenges that they have faced. And so I guess I want you to talk about why you chose to talk about those ideas that you just mentioned through so many stories. How and why did you choose to integrate all of those stories into the book?
Yeah, so really, and I think Maria started us down that road, which is this idea that I wanted to give voice to the children who were impacted. And my deep hope is that readers, again, will either see themselves or see their own children in those stories. And I think it's the stories that compel empathy and move us to action, right? And so, and James, you're absolutely right. I really intentionally try to tell a story, and then weave it together with the data, both local, national, regional data, and then give you the science on adolescent development, the science on cognitive, biases, right? But in a way that I hoped all readers could relate to, a way that was accessible. And I think more than anything, it's the stories that grab you and make you really want to cry and say, there is no way we can be treating any child like this. And then understanding that Black children are treated like this every single day. So it was really very, very intentional. The other thing is, we're here in a university, and we've both written a ton of law review articles. Nobody's going to read a law review article. How do I so much of what I wanted to tell in this book, I wanted to tell to the masses, so that everyday people could understand what happens to Black children. Because I really think even allies don't know, right? We really just don't know the depths of trauma that Black children face. And so my hope was to write something that would be compelling emotionally for everyone.
Well, you did that. You picking up on this idea of the stories. So some of the stories that are in the book are of other children. But some of what's in the book is your own story and stories of your clients. And you talked about crying a few minutes ago. As I was reading the book, I kept thinking, there's so much pain on these pages and so much pain in these pages. And some of the pain is your own. And so I guess I'm curious to know, and then we'll go back into some of the ideas of the book, but just to really put everything on the table, was it hard for you to write? I mean, it feels like it must have been.
It was actually much, much harder to write than I ever thought it would be. I don't think I ever anticipated nights literally of just not being able to sleep, nights of crying through the stories. And it's interesting, as Maria said, I've been representing children in Washington, D.C. for 25 years. I've been a Black woman all my life, right? And please, folks speak up if I'm wrong, but there are so few Black families in this country, I don't care what education level, what class level, who have not been impacted in some way by the criminal and the juvenile legal system. And so when I started writing the book, I didn't know how much of my own story, was going to come out. I had a brother who was very much, you have to read to figure it out, but very much involved in the criminal legal system. And pulling that out was so incredibly painful. But the other thing that really shocked me is you talked about the stories of my clients. So I've lived with those stories, with those clients for 25 years, experienced, nights with them with, vicarious and, trauma from doing the work, but reliving them, going back and pulling those stories was unbelievably painful. And so I am very moved by the fact that you said you could feel the pain. I don't want this to be a traumatizing and triggering experience for the readers, but in a way, that's exactly what it needs to be, right? It's exactly the experience that you need to have to move it. And so the number of people who've said they've shed tears at different stories. I mean, you can rest assured that, the young people in the stories and their parents, imagine what it is to be a Black mother, a Black father, a Black uncle, a Black grandmother, right? And these are their stories, their real stories. Every single one of them is a story of truth. So it was much more, I was shocked. I had nightmares in some chapters. Chapter 11 is where I reveal much of my own personal story. And I just did not know how much it was going to hit me to talk about. But it lives there. And I think that's, one of the threads that we may get to is the trauma, right? The trauma that's evident on its face, but then the trauma that lives deep with young people and Black families in general who have experienced this type of criminalization.
Did you ever think about quitting?
Ooh, great question. Yes. Like maybe I couldn't possibly pull this off. I couldn't keep reliving this. Yeah, I did. And I also too, I felt like I had to get permission. This was the hard part, right? So you're telling other people's stories, you're telling your own story, but you're telling other people's stories, but getting permission to tell those stories. And I was, and I reveal a little bit of that when I finally reached out to a couple of clients. You reach out and you're like, oh my God, I don't want to trigger you because I want to tell the story, because I think the story will advance your cause. And so I will say this throughout the writing. So I wanted to go back to some clients and interview some clients. And some clients were like, no, I don't want to have anything to do with it. And others were all in. And so I had to make choices like that. And even the national story. So, as James says, I weave together stories of my own clients, but I wanted to be a national story so that you don't relegate it and say, that's just DC. Right. No, it's not just DC. It's all over the country. So pulling in those stories from elsewhere was very uncomfortable for me. And so what I did, you talk about pain, was watching interview after interview, documentary after documentary of Black parents, like Trayvon's parents, right? Tamir's mother, right? All of these interviews, Jordan Edwards, parents, hearing it from them, right? So that when I give voice to their stories, it's their voice and not just me and my analytical interpretation. So.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So you cover a lot of ground in terms of, as you said up front, the different ways in which America criminalizes Black youth. But one of the most consistent points of emphasis that you come back to time and time again is the police and policing, and how police end up harming Black children. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about, as you see it, the impact of those day-to-day encounters with the police. What does that individual and cumulative impact look like for Black children?
Yeah. So I was surprised at how much research was out there. And it's a growing body of research on the traumatic effects of policing on communities of color. And then within that, there is a subset of really powerful research on the traumatic effects on adolescents and what it means to grow up, under the constant watch of a police officer. And so one, starting with anecdotes, right? I have clients after clients who tell me that they live in neighborhoods where police are present at all hours of the day and night. Police parked on the street corner, parked right in front of the convenience store. So they get stopped on the way in, they get stopped on the way out. Children who tell me they have insomnia because they can't sleep or are afraid of what their encounters with the police will be like. And so I've known those stories for a long time, and I've witnessed it when we go out and investigate in our cases, but then to find the research that really supported it. And there's a growing body of research, psychological research, demonstrating that children who have frequent contact with the police experience high rates of fear, anxiety, depression, sense of hopelessness, hypervigilance, meaning that they're always on guard, distrusting others. And so they're distrusting police officers, and that distrust transfers over to other adult authority figures like teachers, right? And so schools have become like sort of an extension of the criminal legal systems for so many Black and brown children who live in heavily policed neighborhoods. So this research is really, really powerful. What was also fascinating about the research is that it showed that not only being that you experience this trauma, not only from being the direct target of that police stops, but also from witnessing or hearing about it, right? Among friends and family and the like. And so the idea is that just having to worry about becoming the victim of some sort of police violence was enough to create those same types of symptoms that I already talked about. Also, we know, we're sitting here on the, at the wake of George Floyd's killing on national television. And I imagine in this room, the number of you who experienced some trauma from watching that, right? And then imagine what it must be to be a Black child who wonders, could that be me? Could I be next? And so there's some really powerful research that I found that was amazing. And some of you may be familiar with it. Research done after the Twin Towers collapsed, after the Boston bombing, at the Boston Marathon bombing, and after Katrina, when people watched people stranded on bridges and dying at these very catastrophic events. So the researchers have done similar studies among people who watch police brutality, and found the same sort of post-traumatic stress disorder, hyper-arousal and numbing sensation. So it's really powerful research married with the stories. And the stories are what are painful. I'll just tell you one, the story really to drive home. We represent a client named Kevin, one of my absolute favorite clients, for about 3 years. And I will never forget the day sitting in my office right before the pandemic, in fact, and he calls and he says, "Is there a warrant out for my arrest?" And we're sitting there thinking, no, there's no warrant. Why would you think that? And we could hear his mother in the background yelling, "You're just being paranoid. You're just being paranoid." And I thought to myself, he's not being paranoid. He's traumatized, right? And what he told us was he was sitting in his window and he could see a police car parked outside his building, right? And he was convinced that they were out there waiting for him. And so he wanted to see if there was a warrant. And that's what he lived with. And he's had many traumatizing experiences. And I should really point out, because I imagine some of you are thinking, well, what about the kids who commit crimes? And what about the kids who are innocent? What the research shows is that the trauma is the same regardless, right? And so we're doing for the kids who haven't done anything, who are being stopped by the police, having done nothing at all, are experiencing the same trauma, but that even the kids who have made mistakes, like we all have, or have committed crimes, are experiencing the psychological trauma and stress because they're afraid of violence. They're afraid of what the consequences are. Also, they're aware of the inequities, the racial inequities. Well, yes, I did this, but so did he down the street, and you didn't stop him, right? And so I always, when I do trainings and workshops, I was like, how many of you think our clients, our young people in this country don't know that, yes, they smoke weed, they experiment with drugs, and their white classmates up the street are doing the exact same thing. And so it matters. Yeah.
Thank you, that's powerful. I want to expand out from police for a second and talk about the system more broadly. And I'd love to hear how you kind of think about the problem or the sources of the problem. So let me give you kind of two perspectives. So we not often, but we sometimes hear stories like the judges in Pennsylvania that were selling the kids for cash, or this story that's been all in the news about the judge down in Tennessee who's running this, like this personal fiefdom and runs the jail, and kids are getting locked up for things that obviously they did not do. And that's a kind of that's like a villain story.
Good question. Mm-hmm.
But I think, if I'm right, I don't know, when I read this book, I come away thinking that your story is a little bit different, or your focus anyway. Not to say that there aren't people like that. They are, and they need to be identified, and they need to be removed, from the bench if they're judges or in whatever position of authority they're in. But I think you're telling a more complicated story in some sense, because you're writing about a lot of good-hearted, well-meaning, well-intentioned people. They're not selling kids for cash. But they still end up doing things, taking actions, enacting policies, making choices, handing down sentences, making arrests or not, choosing how to react to a kid that they see on the street who's messing with a bike. Are they a criminal, or do they need help? You have some studies on that. And these well-intentioned, good-hearted people are still perpetuating racial injustice. So I guess I want to know, am I right in that your focus is more on that part of the story than it is on the pure villains?
Yeah, I love this.
And if I'm right, what does that mean for what we need to do about it?
Yeah. So
Because I got my plan for the kids for cash judges like that. I understand.
Yeah. So this is great. And this is such a perfect question coming from James Forman. If any of you have not read his book, right? Locking Up Our Own, and, good-hearted people, over time, making a collection of really poor decisions on behalf of folks. So I'm going to say this to you, James. I think mine is both and, okay? And I think probably you're right. The weight of the stories goes in the latter direction. But I do think both and is important. And so when I talk about both and, there is some intentionality in the system. Right. So then I give a shout out to Paul Butler Chokehold, his book that talks about the system works exactly the way it's supposed to work. Right. So it's both of you all. And so I try to bring both of that together. So let me say a piece about the intentionality. Even if we're not aware of the intentionality today, historically, right, the criminalization of Black youth, there's a through line, right, from the era of slavery in America, right, where children were seen as the Black children were the chattel property. Right. And then we move forward into, the civil rights era, and we have an Emmett Till who can be lynched. Why? As a symbolic statement to the country that we will not tolerate integration. So he's expendable. That's all intentionality. It's symbolic in a number of ways. And so I actually say in the book, one of the most important things is it is no coincidence that the Tamir Rices, the Emmett Tills of the world are penalized, criminalized, dehumanized, and even killed in adolescence, because that establishes the limits and the boundaries of adolescence, right? It's the most critical time to establish the boundaries of what you can do, how you can grow, how you can prosper, what education you're going to get. That's the time, right? Before children test their limits and assert their authority, right? So I think there is some intentionality. And then we move from the civil rights era into the 80s and the 90s, right? And so yes, there was a temporary uptick in crime, but the absolute intentional demonization of Black children during that era, the pseudo-scientific, calling of Black children of super predators. All of that is very, very intentional. So then you get to how do we get to the allies, how do we get to the good-hearted folks who are still criminalizing Black folks? I think it's that history. It is that through line that created these deeply embedded stereotypes and assumptions and fears about Black children that we have not been able to disentangle ourselves from, right? So when good-hearted people like you and me walk through a park at night and we see a group of Black children, you see that scene differently than if you saw those same children and they were white, middle class, and playing in the park. That's where it happens. So I do think you're right, like with the judge in Tennessee and the kids for cash, there is the villain story. And I think the villain story is maybe even outside, maybe even a third nuance than that.
Okay.
There is the abject capitalism, right, that allows the power hunger that comes from those positions, particularly when there's no oversight. Right? But here's the piece that loops us back in to that bias, these deeply embedded fears. You can treat Black children like that without empathy. Because why? Those deeply embedded assumptions are already there. So even if none of this is cognizant, right? Even if the villain is all about the power and the money, you can do that because it's not your kids, right? I firmly believe, even in Kids for Cash, though in the Kids for Cash scenario in Pennsylvania, it was largely white kids, but it's still poor. It's still an othering of the class of children, right? And then in the Tennessee story, it's that story took place in Murfreesboro, Rutherford County. 2/3 of the children in that school were Black and Latino, and there's no way that would persist. We don't even talk about criminalization of normal adolescent behaviors. We don't even think about referring or calling the police for normal adolescent behaviors among most white kids. And so I think I hope that helps. It
does.
Yeah.
It does. And I like the both kind of the both perspective. So I want to last a couple questions from my end before we move to take a couple questions from the audience. And I want to move from kind of problem identification a little bit to talking about solutions and what to do now. I want to ask a question about a particular topic that I think that poses certain challenges that's hard. I want to pick a hard one because
that's what you do.
and a hard one even related to this conversation we were just having about, is this a villain story or is this? So let's talk about police in schools, for example, or police in schools. Let's use that as a stand-in for the broader sort of militarization. And you tell these stories, right? You tell this compelling story about, what it's like to go through metal detectors. Okay, so 20 years ago when we were at PDS, I took some time off to start an alternative school for kids from the juvenile justice system called the Maya Angelou School, still in operation in DC. And when we started, we had no metal detectors. And people said, what? You've got a school for kids who've been locked up and you're not going to have metal detectors. And we're like, no, we're investing in relationships and counseling, and we're going to find out from the kids what's going on so that we can defuse and do restorative justice and all that. And it worked. It was great. Our school was safe. We then moved into a DC public school building to expand. And one of the requirements that the school system imposed on us was to have metal detectors and security guards at the front. And you've been there. Yep. You've bought, that might have been, you could have been at Maya in the scene as far as I know. Okay, good Kris Henning supporter, reader of Rage. I've been lobbying for years as a board member. Why do we still have these metal detectors? And every year, the school administrators do a survey of parents. And you know where I'm going with this. So these are all Black parents. These are all Black working class and poor, for the most part, parents. And every year they come back, big majorities want us to keep this in place. And so obviously this is now presenting the dilemma, right? Why do they do that? They're not doing that because they want to have a school to prison pipeline, that they don't want to have a school that sends the message that their children are criminals. They want safety. And they see that metal detector and that security guard as providing safety. Now, it's not unanimous. There's plenty of people on our side too, but we're the minority. So my question to you is kind of unpack that, because I think that's like an example that you might have in this audience, a school administrator. You might have somebody who kind of wants to do the right thing in their space, but is going up against this collective weight of history that you've identified, right? Because notice, when we didn't have metal detectors, nobody was asking for them, right? But once we had them, they didn't want them taken away. Right? And so this is a way in which because we've created this punitive structure, it is so hard to unwind it, because everything looks like, well, you're taking away my safety when you do that. Don't take the police officer. So how do you recommend those of us that are trying to create change, and you can take my school invitation if you want, or you can broaden it out to something else. How do we engage in conversation in community to try to change people's perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And you've really touched on it. It is, we are so convinced in our country that the only way to achieve safety is through law enforcement. Like, it's just, we just cannot seem to think outside that box. And so I think for me, to the greatest extent possible, can we educate the community, Black parents, leaders, school administrators, on the alternatives and the evidence-based alternatives, like the science, the proof? Can we show it? Can we demonstrate it? But here's the piece. When we say we're going to rely on alternatives to law enforcement, we have to meaningfully support them. We have to invest in them. You can't just put it on the books, lay claim to it without giving money behind it, without reducing class sizes to make it viable. And so I was talking to some police officers in Maryland the other day, and we were talking about truancy. They were saying, "Oh, I'm just so unhappy that our truancy program, has been disbanded, because we really need to get these kids off the street and back into the school." And I was like, "Well, what about non-uniform, non-officer, truancy liaisons hired by the school system?" And they were like, "Yeah, we used to have those, but they stopped funding them." That's exactly what I'm talking about. These methods can't work. Right? So even a well-meaning police officer who wants to help a child doesn't have any resources, right? And so we talk about that. I know in the book, some of the suggestions that I give are having a lot of it is about, you nailed it. And that's what your school for sure, Maya Angelou, is all about, is building relationships. And building relationships with credible messengers, folks who have been in the community, have experienced challenges, poverty, and the like, and engaging those folks in helping young people. That's who we need, in the school. Having more mental health counselors doesn't just mean someone who shows up on Monday and Wednesday, right, for an hour, and whichever kids can be lucky enough to get an appointment, but that it's deeply embedded in the structure of the school system, right, in a non-stigmatizing way, right? And so I think truly that, Black, parents and Black leaders, of course, we all want our kids to be safe, but we've got to understand that, number one, the research shows that school resource officers don't actually make schools any safer. That is actually a myth. There's been no empirical findings that the presence of school resource officers improves public safety. But yet there's been quite a bit of research demonstrating that school resource officers actually undermine the school climate, right? Making Black and brown children in particular feel unwelcome and unsafe. And you remember, I already talked about the trauma. So it's that extension of the trauma from the street into the school. And there's research demonstrating, it's actually quite fascinating. They did this sort of qualitative study of parents, teachers, school administrators, and students. And then they were asking them about school discipline policies and discovered that everybody was using criminal language. So they were talking about, oh yeah, I picked up a charge. Well, like, you don't get a charge in school. And they were talking about, the officers as police officers. And so all of it is really problematic. We've really criminalized our school system. So I think part of that is education. Part of it is giving alternatives. Part of it is putting money behind the alternatives, putting resources, man and woman power behind it is some of that answer to that.
That I just want to tell you that is so helpful. I don't know if any of y'all feel like you had a particular problem that you came to this evening event with that has been solved for you, but I'm just going to tell you, I have my plan as a board member when I go back, because I think I think some of these things you just mentioned, we have not done adequately. I've just accepted these survey results, but I haven't had Kris Henning over to come and lead a conversation and educate folks. And I don't think we've made clear exactly what that investment in alternatives would be. So thank you. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I think we have some questions. Okay, we're going to take some questions from the in the room audience or the online audience. So my last question is on this kind of solutions, what to do at this moment piece that we've just been on. So we have, I don't know who's online, but I know in the room we have some judges, we have some lawyers, we have some law students, we have so you can pick among those audiences. Part of me wants to say, don't pass up an opportunity. You have some juvenile court judges in the room. I do not pass up an opportunity to talk to them about your perspective, about something that they can do, right now, tomorrow, or this month, or this year, something that new, different, that people can try in their courtroom, or if you want to broaden it out, I don't want to put you on the spot. I kind of want to put you on the spot.
I can do that. I can take it.
Go.
I think that's great. And I'm actually really, really, really pleased, to see the judiciary present and interested and engaged in these conversations. And I think there's so much that we can talk about. I'll say this, and I am going to choose to talk to judges and to lawyers in particular, because I think the problem is a cultural problem that we all have to address. But in the meantime, before we have a massive cultural shift about Black children, in the meantime, we can do what we can do in the system. And we cannot practice law without recognizing that race matters. Race matters in every critical legal question in the juvenile and criminal legal system. It just does. I could pick one and talk about it. And my favorite to talk about is the Fourth Amendment, which is easy, right? And so for people who aren't lawyers, who are listening in, I say all the time that most people get to walk through their neighborhood every day, go about their business, go to school, go to the grocery store, and not worry about being stopped by the police without some, here's a legal word, reasonable, articulable suspicion that they are, committing a crime. But Black children today are unequivocally deprived of that freedom, that liberty to walk and be, to enjoy the rights that all the rest of us do. And so when I think about like the Fourth Amendment, one doesn't have to call anybody racist in the legal system to recognize that race matters in multiple critical questions. Like number one, whether or not there is a seizure or not for purposes, whether or not someone has been stopped by the police such that they have a right to suppression of evidence, as it were, the seizure question. And so I say all the time, what does it mean to be a Black child? So the criminal legal system and the Fourth Amendment, your liberty interest is conditioned on a reasonable person. But traditionally, a reasonable person has been a white male, reasonably well-off, educated person, right? And so I might, as an older white male, feel free to walk away from the police, to exercise my freedom and my right. How many of you, by a show of hands, think that an average Black child feels free to walk away from the police, even if they walk up and say hello, without any, the fear? So I think even on a question like that, all right, seizure, whether or not someone has been seized, a Black child feels like they have no choice but to comply. Why? Because their parents have told them to, because they've seen evidence of brutality on the news and the media. So that's an example. We talk about consent to search, right? So children are constant. I think it's a horrible practice. Police officers walk up to a child and say, can I see your waistband so I can see whether you're carrying a weapon? Or can I search you? Can I frisk you? What does a Black child say? Please, go ahead. Why? Not because they want to, not because it's voluntary, because they're afraid. All right. And so my statement is, this has probably got a little too into the weeds, but
it's good.
But the point is that as a judge, as a lawyer, race matters in those questions. And I think the Supreme Court has given us freedom, even with the reasonable person. There's been some give. Even in Illinois versus Wardrobe, I'm going to really pull out. I hope there's some crim law folks in the room, right? Which that was the Supreme Court case that said that it was appropriate for police officers and civilians to consider nervousness, right, and flight in determining whether someone had demonstrated a consciousness of guilt, right? Black children run. If they're not freezing because they're afraid, they run because they're afraid, right? And so even then, the Supreme Court, Justice Stevens, in his concurrence in that opinion, recognized, wait a minute, you all, we're going down a slippery slope here. We cannot say that flight from the police is always evidence of guilt. In fact, it might be some other innocent reason that people, particularly minorities, run and flee from the police. And so there's a lot of that. You get some in Justice Sotomayor's opinion. I think we've had some movement around the amenability, the relevance of race. And then, I'll say this, sitting in Illinois, you can disavow, the state Supreme Court can disavow some, or based on state high court constitution, can disavow. We think about Wren versus United States. That was the case that said, pretext traffic stop is okay under the Fourth Amendment. It might be an equal protection violation, which nobody can prove, by the way, right? But it's okay under the Fourth Amendment. But we've had at least 4 state high courts in the United States just disavow Wren, right? So there's room, there's movement. So that's what I would say. So,
thank you.
way too in the weeds.
So with that, I think we're going to take some audience questions now. I'll walk around the room, and then we'll try to also get another one. Just raise we'll do this the old-fashioned way. Raise your hand and I'll walk around. Oh, okay. Let me.
I'm going to start by telling you what some of my colleagues say about the issue of race. Some of them say that I don't see race or color. I just see the individual that's standing in front of me, and I call the balls and strikes. And I believe that they believe that this is the way to fight racism, not to see color, to have color blindness. Do you agree?
Beautiful question, and the answer is absolutely not, right? Race is absolutely unequivocally interwoven from the inception, right? I mean, race impacts how the laws were written, how the laws are interpreted, how the laws are applied disparately. And so we can't ignore that. And judges have to correct for that, have to take that into account. And so some of what I talked about, the reasonable, I talk about in some other writings, not in this book, but the reasonable Black child, right? What does it mean to be an adolescent? And how does that affect our interpretation of law? And what does it mean to be African American? And how does that affect our interpretation of the law? What's so interesting is we're willing to use the law to the advantage of the dominant class. But when we need to make accommodations in our interpretation and our reading of the law to account for people of color, we're not willing to do it. All of a sudden, we want to be colorblind. And so I think we cannot, in today's society, disentangle race from the law because the law isn't colorblind, and it never has been. So what's interesting is that to make it more nuanced and to recognize, it may well be that the judge who's saying that is coming from a good place. That this is how I think I fight racism, is by being colorblind. But I mean, it misses the broader point. It ignores the through line that we've been talking about. It ignores the racialized history that gave us the doctrine of law that we have today. And so we have to grapple with it. And implicit biases are real, right? They're real and alive. And so if we don't acknowledge them, it's the people who think they're colorblind. I say this a lot when I do workshops and trainings, this notion of bias blind spots, the idea that everyone else is racist but me. Well, guess what? That leaves us more vulnerable to acting on our own biases.
Just one follow-up question or comment. The follow-up to having this discussion with a colleague, the response was, well, we all know that Black Americans commit more violent and gun crimes, and the stats support that when you look at the FBI uniform, statistics. So,
how do you answer that?
I said, wow, this is deep. I wasn't prepared to engage in the way I wanted to. I wanted to revert to a feeling of hopelessness that we are lost if we have folks like this.
Right.
So that was my thought.
So I'll say a little inside. We were talking today at lunch, a group of us were talking today at lunch about how difficult it must be to be a judge, right? To be lonely. It must be a lonely occupation when you understand these issues that we're talking about today and you share the bench with folks who don't understand. So let me just validate that for you and that sense of hopelessness, because I hear you. So I get this question a lot, though. This question about crime and crime being on the rise, and isn't it true that the data shows that Black folks commit more crime? I'm sorry, what data is that? That's the arrest data, right? It's the arrest data. So first thing I often say to people, we're looking at the wrong data sets. And what I love about my specialization in adolescent development, there is a wonderful body of what they call self-report data that is published every single year for many, many years, where children of all races and ethnicities across the United States report their own delinquent behavior. And it includes things like carrying a weapon to school, using drugs of every single type, getting into fights. It's all kinds of risky, delinquent criminal behavior. And what the self-report studies show is that children of all ages are engaged in the same types of delinquent, risky, and even violent behaviors. And that actually Black youth, white youth, are more likely in many, if not most instances, to engage in that behavior than Black youth, okay? So it's a myth, the self-report data. And I urge you, I actually talk about this in the book. I actually forgot.
Yeah, you talk about it in a very, very persuasively so.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. When I stumbled upon it, like, it's really amazing that we've all been looking at the wrong data. So that's one thing I want to say. Self-report data isn't consistent with that. It's so if I send you, right, if I send all the police to the Black neighborhood, then I'm going to drive up that data, right? And then with regard to violent crime, this is the other thing, and particularly since we're talking about adolescents, it is an absolute myth that Black children are these violent predators that we think that they are. Very, very few children, adolescents and teenagers commit violent crimes of any race, right? The vast majority, absolute vast majority of children who are in the juvenile legal system at any stage, including secure detention on the back end, committed to residential placement facilities, are there for low-level offenses, misdemeanors, non-violent, property offenses, not for violent. And the data shows that only 9% of all arrests for Black children are violent offenses. So it's really a myth. We bought into the data that's skewed, and that's how race matters, right? Because I can create the data that I want to support my position by sending resources out to arrest in Black neighborhoods. So that's one of the ways in which I get at that. There's so much more to say, but we'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I'm going to take one more question over here, and then we might have time for more.
Good evening. What do you say to well-intended folks, right, who need someone like you with credentials to say all this to them versus actually listen to the people that are around them, or listen to the people that have lived experience, or listen to the people that actually in their community, right? I think oftentimes we get in space in higher education, we need somebody that has a doctorate degree and all this other stuff to give them statistics for them to believe, versus actually listening to someone that might not be as credentialed, saying the exact same thing that you said, that race matters. What do you say to those individuals?
I'll tell you, chapter 12, so I offer up a series of recommendations. One of the earliest recommendations in chapter 12 is I say, if you want to know how to make the lives of Black and brown children better, ask them. Ask them. So I 100% agree with you, right? It is, and one of the other solutions is getting proximate, right? Getting close to Black children to dispel your fears and to really know and understand their joy, their promise, their laughter, their talent, their smarts, all of it. And so I'm with you. Like I just wanted to start there. Like I hate that people have to read my book to, because because of credentials. That said, that's in part, James asked the question earlier, why do I tell stories? Because I wanted to give voice to their stories, right? And it's my hope that you create space, right? If I see you and I see my child in that story, then I'm less afraid to go talk to them and to hear from them. Other solutions that I talk about in the book, for legislative folks, is to create a space at the table to hear from the young people and the families and the parents who've been most impacted, creating internships, creating opportunities for protest. I have a chapter where I talk about how we demonize, Black protest, but Black teenagers haven't been given the opportunity to participate in mainstream democratic process. Their voices aren't heard, maybe because they can't articulate it the way that we articulate it. So I talk about that and the need to recognize protest, even on the street, as a form of political engagement, of civic responsibility that we laud when we see white kids doing it. We need to do the same for Black kids. So I really love and honor that question. You're so right about that.
Okay, one final question, and then we'll close it out and get you in the back for the wonderful book.
Chris and James, thank you for being here. I have a sort of a longitudinal question, I guess, in a sense. You talked about the studies you referred to in the book of the traumatizing effect on Black youth, of the social milieu and policing, especially in all the ways you describe policing. And it occurs to me that if it's the 2010s, and that's happening with youth, well, mom and dad had their own experience in the 80s with subordination, and the specifics probably were different, but the overall problem was the same for mom and dad. And grandma had the same in the 50s.
Yeah.
They had their own sort of experience with this. And I'm wondering now how that accretes or accumulates, and if anybody's looked at the sort of traumatic effects on, now you're the parent of Black adolescents and the fears you're feeling about what they're going to encounter and how they're going to negotiate the world. You're feeling those fears as a parent, and that's built on your own experience and your parents' experience before you back, 400 years. And I'm just wondering whether anybody's sort of looked at the transgenerational effects of this.
So it's a great question. As a preface, I have a sentence in the book where I say that the tensions between Black youth and the police are at an all-time high. And then, so that's in the book, it's printed. And then I was doing an interview last week, and I said that, and I said to myself, I was like, wait a minute, there was a civil rights era. I was like, it feels like it's an all-time high because it's happening right now, but I had the same reaction to my own book, that like, it had to be, this way for Black parents and Black kids during that era. So I just think it just looks different now. And so, yes, it is the cumulative, effects. And so I have been asked in previous workshops unrelated to the books about this question of intergenerational trauma, right? And I think it's a complicated question, right? Because it can go awry. You could, end up in the wrong place pretty quickly if we, right, people use it wrong. It can be weaponized, right? The idea that Black parents who've been traumatized in the past then traumatize their own children. So it becomes another, and feeds into the child welfare and the dependency, paternalism, and, so that's a dangerous space, but it's true. There's some truth in it, right? And so then what is it? So I think what I say is that it's really difficult. I talk about this a bit in the book, difficult. I can't even imagine the fine line that Black parents have to walk. And there's research talking about you have to, as a parent, prepare your children for the discrimination that they will face, both for psychological well-being, so that they're not what they call these moments, you're caught off guard, right? Disorienting moments. You want to have those, you want your children to have those disorienting moments in the safe space of your home, right? Instead of out on the street. So you want to prepare them for that, equip them with some skills to respond, right? Teach them strategies, survival strategies to stay safe. But at the same time, research also suggests that you have to do that carefully, because if you're not careful, then you have Black children who believe that there are no allies and that really are poorly equipped to engage in a society that is dominated by people who don't look like them. And so it's a really fine and delicate line to walk. And I think this question of trauma and this generational trauma, has an impact on that, right? Black folks who've grown up really in deeply traumatic situations have a much harder time walking that fine line if they carry the bitterness, with them from place to place. So that's one. I mean, there's so many threads. There's a whole thread around epigenetics that you don't want to get into, but it's a fascinating question. I don't cover it much other than in this notion of Black identity development and how is it that a Black parent raises a child to be a part of and yet independent of, this American system of racism. And so, part of it is also teaching, one of the solutions that the research talks about is overcoming the trauma. Really, Black parents have to instill pride. So Black pride and Black cultural identity, race identity is hugely important as one of the strategies to overcome the trauma of the racial history of our country. So, and it's not satisfying. It's not a fully satisfying answer, but some early thoughts about it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you for being here with us tonight in person. Thanks to all of you who have joined us virtually. We're so grateful for your time, your attention, and we're especially grateful to Kris and James for this very important conversation. Before we close out the evening, a reminder that Kris's book is being sold in the back. She will sign copies. Please buy the book. Please read the book. Please gift the book. It's incredibly important, especially in these times. The virtual audience should have a link as well. Father David Jones, the pastor at St. Benedict the African in Inglewood, will close out the evening for us. Thank you again.
Yes. I was going to read your last paragraph, which is so good. but you know, she stepped on me.
Please join me in prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Gracious and almighty, loving God, as we listen and learn and ponder these often complex and textured issues, we ask you to keep us mindful of your simplicity. Where we see Black children growing, let us see your Son being born. Where we see Black children being criminalized, let us see your Son being crucified. And where we see people of goodwill coming together to try to do better and be better, let us see your Son rising. Thank you for the words of this night. May they lead to the actions of the morning, God willing, and the creek don't rise. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.